For centuries, whispers of hidden wisdom have echoed through ancient texts, secret Across the ancient world, from temples to tombs, the same patterns appear. Proportions that echo each other, alignments with the stars, symmetries too precise to be coincidence. What were the builders of old trying to tell us? And why does it feel like modern design has lost the message? Whether we realize it or not, our lives are shaped by symbols. We worship them, fear them, trust them, and few of us ever ask where they came from. Symbols actually spoke before we did. First, they were carved and then painted into cave walls, and then eventually whispered through ancient geometry. And maybe their true meaning hasn't been changed, but perhaps our understanding has just been distorted. Once tools of illumination, now tools of power. But what if the original energy of these symbols wasn't meant to control or trick us? In his writings and lectures, Manly P. Hall said that symbols were a language. They were a way of transmitting sacred truths and to preserve wisdom over time. Some are obvious, like popular corporate logos, but others blend in so well they feel almost organic. But even those still hold sacred truths, forgotten by time. In this episode, we follow Manly P. Hall deep into symbolism, the architecture of reality. A place where meaning is encoded in geometry and emblems passed down through a millennia. But not all who wield these symbols do so with noble intentions. Symbols that were originally created to be the tools for spiritual awakening today have become instruments of control. They're guiding the masses through a pattern most never even pause to recognize. We're surrounded by symbols every day. Interior design choices, branding, our clothes and accessories. But what we don't realize is that every curve and angle could hold an ancient meaning. Hall believed that long before words, humanity spoke through signs, starting through crude cave markings developing over time into written alphabets, and that the most powerful of those symbols never disappeared. We've just forgotten their power. If the human soul had an architecture, what would it look like? Today we explore how sacred symbols moved from temple walls to corporate logos, and how their meanings still shape our cities. It's the same golden thread that Hall followed. And if we want to understand what he said was the soul's journey, we have to first understand the spaces that were built to awaken them. Across the earth stand monuments to memory. They represent something eternal. Long before language, humanity spoke through symbols, and the great temples of the world were its first books. The ancients didn't just build, they encoded. Through stone, they mapped the human journey from ignorance to illumination. The temple wasn't just a gathering hall, it was scripture in 3D. In Symbolism, the Universal Language, Hall writes, Symbols are the language of the mysteries. In fact, they are the mysteries. The use of symbols is a means of preserving and concealing truths. Symbols are, therefore, not only a means of preserving truth, but they are also the keys to unlocking it. There's a theme here that symbols were an essential part of ancient culture, a way for people in the know, for lack of a better term, to communicate across nations in secret, and to hide knowledge from the unworthy and only reveal it to the initiated. To the ancients, the universe was built in layers: physical, psychological, and spiritual. Symbols were the conduit to understanding this. They were little reminders of how to return to our higher nature. In Egypt, the Temple of Luxor was a map of the human body. As the initiate moved deeper, they were ascending through their own anatomy. The initiate moved through chambers that mirrored the human form, from the feet at the entrance to the head at the Holy of Holies. Hall believed the entire temple was an allegory for the awakening of consciousness, designed with anatomical precision. When I first looked at the ground plan of Luxor, my first thought was, all right, but it's crooked. Well, as it happens, this was completely intentional and for a few reasons that are completely fascinating. According to esoteric interpretations, including those echoed by Hall, the crooked alignment represents the path of initiation. The straight line is the profane path. The bend represents the moment of transformation or redirection, a symbolic veering away from the material world into the spiritual. As Hall and others have suggested, only those who are spiritually awake can follow the true path, even when it bends in unexpected ways. Additionally, we can't forget that Egyptian temples were often aligned with celestial bodies, stars, solstices, or the Nile's orientation. The shift in axis may reflect a realignment with new astronomical events or deities as the initiate progresses deeper into the temple. Lastly, the temple's crooked axis can also be seen as a metaphor. Truth is not a straight line. Just like symbolic language, the path of enlightenment is obscured and must be navigated carefully. The bend also creates a psychological and sensory shift. As you progress, you are no longer in line with the external world. You are being gradually removed from it. This reinforces the sense of entering a sacred mystery, not just a physical structure. In Cambodia, Angkor Wat rises like a celestial mandala. Its central tower symbolizes Mount Meru, the sacred axis between worlds. Its orientation aligns perfectly with the solstices and equinoxes, reflecting the soul's journey through cycles of time and renewal. The mandala is often a map of initiation, moving from the chaotic outer layers inward to the divine center, the self, the truth, the source. The monad is both the beginning and the destination of that journey. In Manly P. Hall's language, it's the divine spark within, the pure essence we return to after passing through all the planes of manifestation. Hall wrote that all true architecture begins with sacred geometry. The triangle, the square, and circle were not just shapes, they were symbols of spirit, matter, and the eternal. In London, the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral arches toward the divine like a beacon of sacred proportion. Designed by Freemason Sir Christopher Wren, its geometry was rooted in Hermetic truth. In the mainstream analysis, the dome symbolizes the heavens, the floor, the world below. After the Great Fire of London destroyed the original St. Paul's in 1666, Wren's new design included a phoenix rising from flames on the south pediment. The inscription, Resurgam, Latin for I shall rise again. But not all the iconography in St. Paul's is so resplendent. For many, St. Paul's inspires awe. But for those with sharper eyes, its towering form and gilded emblems reveal something else entirely. It's a cathedral of control. First off, let's just point out the obvious. If we look at the cathedral's layout, it looks like a crucifix, which is not uncommon for these old churches, but it's always worth noting that the crucifix is just a deconstructed cube, so we can just start there. Next, we have the site of its construction. St. Paul sits at a power center of London's key ley lines, which means that this location has serious energetic significance. The massive dome of St. Paul's is inspired by St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and the Pantheon before that, both rooted in imperial power. From a Gnostic perspective, domes often represent the false firmament, the illusory heaven created by the demiurge to enclose souls. And then we can move inside the structure itself. Christopher Wren, the architect, was a Freemason and an astronomer. The proportions of the cathedral reflect sacred geometry, but not in a liberating sense. It's a monument to reason, empire, and divine kingship, subtly reinforcing the idea that the divine is inseparable from imperial rule. Statues of apostles, kings, and military leaders line the interior of the crypt, effectively deifying those who enforced the system. The altar at St. Paul's Cathedral is framed by classic Masonic motifs: a checkered floor beneath the dome, the duality of light and dark, spirit and matter. In esoteric traditions, this symbolizes the illusion of opposites, the tension that keeps the initiate asleep. Embedded into the floor, eyes. The all-seeing eye, often understood to symbolize divine omniscience, but through another lens, it aligns more closely with surveillance, control, and the watching presence of a higher power. Above the altar stands the baldacchino, a throne canopy. It mirrors the architectural power of empire. Columns, gold, shadowed recesses. It's not exactly an invitation to worship, it's more a statement of dominion. None of this is accidental, of course. The entire structure is aligned to amplify authority, hierarchy, and surveillance, cloaked in religious grandeur. In Gnostic terms, it's not a temple of the true light, but a monument to the archons. Lastly, as an interesting callback to our last episode on America's Secret Destiny, out front at the base of Queen Anne's statue, there's a figure who represents America standing over a severed head and none other than a reptilian figure. To Hall, the sacred architecture didn't belong to one religion. It belonged to divine truth. Wren believed that beauty, true harmonious beauty, could uplift the soul, and St. Paul's, to him, was his sermon in stone. In Lectures on Ancient Philosophy, Hall notes that true symbols are eternal. They recur in all cultures because they emerge from truth itself, not from human invention. An upright triangle represents fire, not because someone just decided that it did, but because fire expresses the principle of upward motion, aspiration, and purification. Geometry was a universal language, a form of initiation encoded into the stones themselves. And whether it's Egypt, Cambodia, or London, these places weren't only built to impress, they were built to communicate. And Hall didn't just study sacred architecture, he actually lived inside of it. In the 1920s, Manley and his first wife, Fay, were invited to live in one of Frank Lloyd Wright's early Los Angeles designs, an experimental home called the Ennis House. Inspired by the geometry of Mayan temples, its design was both futuristic and ancient, a temple disguised as a residence. For Hall, this was like divine continuity, the same sacred principles just poured into concrete instead of limestone. Because architecture in his mind was sort of like spiritual technology. The Ennis House reflected what Hall believed deeply, that space could shape consciousness, that symbols etched into walls, angles, and light could help awaken something long buried in the soul. From Egypt to Europe, the builders were more than craftsmen, they were initiates, members of esoteric guilds whose knowledge was passed in silence. Every arch pointed heavenward. Every stained glass window told a story in light and color. The cathedral was a cosmic machine, meant to guide the soul with every step. Chartres Cathedral in France was Hall's favorite example. He called it a stone encyclopedia of sacred truths. He said the labyrinth inlaid in the floor was a walking meditation, symbolizing the soul's path from confusion to center, from multiplicity to unity. The rose window was a geometric representation of cosmic order, reflecting the Platonic ideal of divine harmony and the unfolding of the soul. Zodiac signs and alchemical symbols appear carved into the outer walls in a Christian cathedral, a direct nod to Hermetic and Gnostic thought. And the cathedral wasn't built by medieval peasants. It was constructed under the direction of guilds with sacred knowledge, what Hall would call keepers of the eternal religion. These were initiates, many of them tracing their lineage, symbolically or otherwise, to Egypt, Chaldea, and Greece, and through them to Atlantis. Just like Hiram Abiff in the Masonic legend, the seeker walks a path of symbols, each one holding a fragment of the lost world. Hall believed that when these fragments are remembered, the soul begins to rebuild the temple from within. Chartres houses the famous Black Madonna of the Crypt, believed by some to be the survival of the earth goddess, Isis or Demeter, disguised as the Virgin Mary. Hall saw this as a smoking gun, that the ancient goddess religion was never fully erased. In Secret Teachings, Hall describes two kinds of initiates: those who protect symbols to preserve meaning, and those who exploit symbols to conceal it. There are those who have the key, but not the conscience. The same symbol can build a temple or a trap. Hall believed many of the world's most powerful institutions use symbolic language, but strip it of soul, or even worse, invert it. Hall explained in his book, Words to the Wise, when man ceases to understand symbols, he becomes governed by them, and when he remembers, he governs himself. Hall believed that the founding of America was not just political, but spiritual. In his book, Secret Destiny of America, he wrote, "The United States was the first modern country founded on the blueprint of ancient mysteries. The Capitol, the White House, and Washington Monument form more than a triangle. They form a ritual landscape, a symbolic order meant to channel a spiritual power." According to Manly P. Hall, Washington, D.C. was designed as a modern temple. The grid, the monuments, the alignments were entirely purposeful, and most importantly, energetic. In The Secret Destiny of America, Hall argued that the Founding Fathers were acting under the influence of an invisible order, a spiritual brotherhood with ancient roots. He believed this group guided the construction of America as a vessel for liberty, illumination, and the soul's evolution. But symbols that were once meant to initiate can just as easily hypnotize. Geometry that once lifted the soul can be used to anchor it like a ball and chain. It all depends on who draws the lines and why. In Hall's words, the symbols of the mysteries are neutral. They bestow power, but it is man who chooses how that power is used. So I have to ask, if Washington was built as a temple, then who or what is at its altar? The symbols remain, but meaning shifts depending on who's using them, and power typically likes to work in silence. But maybe the question isn't why they're used, but who they're serving. And were the Founding Fathers building for the citizens' assent or their own? To some, it's a city of light. To others, a ritual landscape, where ancient symbols serve modern empires. And in that ambiguity lies the real mystery. We see the same symbols show up again and again: pyramids, all-seeing eyes, mandalas of sacred geometry. Some say it's proof of control. Others say it's a divine language. Maybe it's both. Because the same knowledge that can free the soul can also be used to enslave it, depending on the hands that hold it. Sometimes it's not about the symbols themselves. It's about the intention behind them. A spiral can raise consciousness or pull you into a loop that you can never escape. The same fire that lights a temple can burn it to the ground. That's why thousands of years ago, this knowledge was kept so secret and required initiation, because it's too easily misused. But Hall warned these symbols were not always used for light. In many cases, the sacred was hijacked. What once initiated now dominates. What once liberated now controls. These symbols repeat because they're powerful. The problem isn't that they exist, it's that their meaning was stolen, repackaged, and then weaponized. The same serpents that once represented healing and spiritual power now adorn logos of billion-dollar drug firms who peddle dependency, not health. Take Meta, home to Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. They use a symbol that looks like it could be an artistic take on an infinity sign, when, in actuality, it's what's called a Mobius loop. The infinity sign is a powerful esoteric glyph symbolizing eternal life, unlimited energy, and non-duality. However, the Mobius loop actually is an allegory for losing control. It's again an inversion, a loop of attention, binding the user in a closed, addictive pattern. In Hall's terms, this is the lower octave of the serpent, perpetual motion without transformation. A more obvious example would be the Red Cross, who hold a reputation for humanitarian aid, peacekeeping, and disaster relief. The symbol, of course, is a carbon copy of the Knights Templar cross, an esoteric symbol of sacrifice, secrecy, and crusade. In some interpretations, it references a blood covenant, or initiation by ordeal. Hall wrote, "The cross has always symbolized initiation through suffering, but when wielded as a banner of authority, it may lead not to peace, but to conquest." Symbols of aid can still be symbols of hierarchy. A red cross is still a sword in disguise. The ChatGPT logo is a painfully obvious example of this from several different angles. Of course, in the very center, we have a black hexagon, another symbol for the black cube of Saturn. In addition, there are 6 shapes turning the hexagon into a knot or a vortex. The logo's 6-fold symmetry mirrors the Seal of Solomon, which Hall associated with the union of opposites. Hall wrote, "The intellect alone cannot lead to wisdom. It must be wedded to intuition, or else it becomes its own prison, a mind with no conscience." Like the most powerful logos and sigils, it whispers ancient authority without having to say a word. It evokes harmony, intelligence, eternity, while concealing a deeper truth, that mind without soul is dangerous, and that symbols disconnected from initiation don't enlighten, they entrap. The pyramid, the all-seeing eye, the obelisk, they were never evil. They were reminders, tools of awakening, but in the wrong hands, even truth becomes a trap. Hall spoke of 2 kinds of initiates, the true seeker and the false one, the one who preserves wisdom for the good of humanity, and those who hoard it for control, something Hall spent his life fighting against through his books and lectures. He said, "They took the language of the soul and made it into a system of power, not to elevate, but to ensnare." And yet, Hall believed that the power behind these symbols was still pure, still sacred, still ours to remember. Hall warned that a civilization that forgets its sacred geometry forgets itself. Buildings shape thought. Cities shape spirit. It's all energy. And when those spaces lose harmony, so does the soul. Where once we built to elevate, we now build to dominate, to distract, to divide. Still, I think our souls remember. And some buildings, or at least parts of them, still whisper the old truths. The language isn't lost. it's just forgotten. In quiet corners of cities and minds, sacred geometry is returning. Architects, artists, and seekers are rebuilding the temple one intention at a time. In New Delhi, the Lotus Temple opens like a blooming soul. Surrounded by water, it appears to float, shaped like a blooming 27-petal lotus, a sacred symbol across Hinduism, Buddhism, and Hermetic traditions. The structure uses groupings of 3s and 9s. Numbers Hall repeatedly ties to universal balance and spiritual completeness. The building is constructed of white marble, known for its metaphysical properties associated with grounding, stability, and promoting a sense of serenity and clarity. It's surrounded by reflecting pools, creating the illusion that the temple is floating, like a manifestation of the astral plane. The same knowledge that can enslave can awaken. The same geometry that traps can guide. It all depends on how we choose to use it and the heart that understands it. We don't really need temples to find the sacred. The real pattern was never etched in stone, it was inside of us. The real question is, how can we help each other to recognize it again? And maybe that's the real mystery. Not what we've lost, but what we're still surrounded by, if only we remember how to look. Energy flows where attention goes. What we build reflects what we believe. The shapes we live in, the symbols we surround ourselves with, every line, every form, gives off a vibration. It affects us, it shapes us, whether we realize it or not. It's all connected, the outer world, the inner world, as above, so below. What we see in the world, we see in ourselves. And what we shape, shapes us in return. What we build, builds us. And if the soul is the real cathedral, then sacred space isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. Next time on Hall of Mysteries, they claim to guard the light of ancient wisdom, but what happens when that light is hidden intentionally? From the ashes of burned libraries and outlawed scrolls, a new kind of secrecy took root. One cloaked in symbols, oaths, and silence. Freemasons, Rosicrucians, Templars. Were they preserving a sacred tradition or forging a new power in its image? In the next episode, we'll trace the hidden thread from mystery temples to ancient lodges and uncover the truths they couldn't bury. Join us next time for Hall of Mysteries, the stewards of the sacred flame. This is Hall of Mysteries, and the veil is lifting.